Hello B Block. In this edition of my video lecture series on communism, I want to just go through pages from the bottom of page 6 to the end of page 11, and then we'll look at the next source-based exercise together. So please make sure you've got your notes open in front of you to the bottom of page 6, where it introduces the story of the Russian Revolution and its turn towards communism. So Russia was this contradiction by the beginning of the 20th century. It had undergone industrialization. It had been exposed to many European ideas, such as the democracy or republicanism of the French Revolution. It had formed an alliance with France, and it had ties to all the other royal families. As you know, by the time of World War I, the Kaiser of Germany, the Tsar of Russia, and the King of England were all actually cousins, all related to Queen Victoria. And so there was a Germanic strain in the royal family. So there's industrialization, exposure to modern ideas, and then a connection with the rest of Europe. But it was also still an Eastern country. It was also still dominated by agriculture and peasant life, and there was still this mystical belief that the Tsar was not a king but a father of his people, that he had this spiritual connection with the land and with the people. And gradually, because of the pressures of World War I and the influence of Marxism, you eventually had this explosion of a revolution in Russia. These contradictions finally led to a disaster. So you began to look at the geography of Russia on page 7, and that was really just to show you the extent of it, to show you that parts of it were close to Europe, parts of it were close to the Middle East, and then parts of it close to China and Japan. And one of the chief problems they had was that this was very difficult to manage, especially because it was an autocracy. There was one man, in effect, governing it. It was not just made up of Russian ethnicity, an ethnic Russian population. There were many different people groups, and there was also this separation between the Tsar as a ruler and his people. He was in St. Petersburg, living in a royal court, seen as the father figure, but often was not aware of what was happening in the country around him. And then there were also the important concept you needed to be aware of, that the peasants were known as serfs. And serfs were often tied to the land that they worked. So when you bought land, the serfs came with it. Now, Tsar Alexander II, he actually went out and saw what serfdom was like. And in 1861, he emancipated the serfs. Now, serfdom wasn't slavery. So it was a form of control, but it certainly was nothing like American slavery, which was also abolished round about that time. But he decided to free the serfs, but the problem was they were tied up in the value of the land. And just like when the slaves were freed in the British Empire, the slave owners were reimbursed. The way he could get the nobles to buy in was to ensure that the peasants paid back a debt to the landowners. Now, not only did this cause problem, but these peasant serfs now suddenly had a whole new way of life that they'd struggled to manage, and this caused a disorientation amongst them in society. But he also established university, reduced punishments. And then there was this significant moment where he established the city of Vladivostok. I'm on the top of page 9 now. Just remember, you can pause anytime you want. And then he began that city was built there to rival Japan, and that would lead them into a war, which would lead them into the first of their revolutions. Remember, John F. Kennedy says communism only and revolution only arise from a country in chaos and corruption. And war brought that on for Russia on 2 occasions. Russia also began to see itself as the guardian of all Slavic people. all the people of Eastern Europe, Russians and Ukrainians and Serbians, who generally were all Greek Orthodox, the ancient church which had split from the Catholic Church in the 11th century, but was still regarded as a traditional church connected with the apostles. And that would have a great impact, because that would be one of the motivators for Russia to enter World War I, to protect the Serbs, because they shared the same religion. So you have Alexander the second, who tries to reform society, but he's still assassinated. There are groups of revolutionaries and liberals who imbibed European ideas. Some of them have just imbibed kind of democratic ideas. Some have imbibed Marxist revolutionary or anarchist ideas. And so he gets assassinated. And so his son reacts against his father's reforms. And he kind of retreats into nationalism once again. And when it is discovered a plot to assassinate him, the conspirators are executed. And the brother of one of the conspirators is Lenin, who was originally called Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, and like Stalin takes on this new name. And Lenin he spends an exile in Siberia as a result of his connections with these revolutionaries. Exile wasn't, he took his family, he even had a housemaid, like Karl Marx. They both had servants working in their house, good communists. And they found together he and some other Marxists, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. Now, it's going to get confusing, all these names for different political parties in Russia, so you're just going to have to pay attention to that. Alexander III eventually dies in 1894 and is succeeded by Nicholas II. Now, Nicholas II marries Alexandra, who's German, and this will become significant later on. And Nicholas II is often seen as a good man, often seen as a sincere man of integrity, but he just couldn't navigate his times. And there was also this problem in their family, that his heir, after having many daughters, 4 daughters, his heir, Alexis, has hemophilia, which means that if he gets knocked or if he gets cut, his blood doesn't clot. And this kind of becomes an obsession with him, because he's the heir. And this kind of distracts them almost from the issues of the country. Now, I mentioned the rivalry with Japan. Now, when Russia loses the war with Japan, and this was not meant to happen, Russia is a great empire, Japan was just a rising force at this stage, this allows for some of the hostility towards the Tsar and the ruling authorities to come to the surface, and a priest actually organizes a huge march. And most people thought when they were joining the march that they were there to just ask the Tsar for help. But the actual document they presented was revolutionary. And because the Winter Palace felt under threat, and even though the Tsar was not there, the guards fired on the protesters, and as a result, you had this revolution, this mass protest movement, and it became obvious that the Tsar needed to make concessions to some of the liberals and to some of the workers who felt disempowered and neglected by the current system. Remember, industrialization always, and it did the same in the United Kingdom, Britain, it brings dislocation, because instead of being on the land now, you have these industrial workers moving to cities, and often they face poor working conditions. And that's what these workers were experiencing. And so one of the things they wanted was a reduced working day and so forth. It was still this, as capitalism began, there was in Russia, it never actually got fully going, because the communist revolution came before then. But the problem they faced was that capitalism doesn't easily exist in a traditional society. And so there was this contrast between peasant life, the serfs, the Tsar, and this burgeoning capitalism where workers were finding their place and also trying to seek rights, as they were simply being used as cheap labor. So that's Bloody Sunday in 1905. Several hundred people were killed, including some children. And Nicholas seemingly was fairly unaware of what happened. And then we go to page 12. So you should have all read up to page 11. And now we're on page 12. And this is a source-based exercise that looks at the causes of the revolution. And we're going to go through this together now. I want you to read through all the sources first on your own now. So pause the video now and then go and read through all the sources. I'll see you in a few minutes. Welcome back. So source A is a pie chart showing the breakdown of Russian society. Very easy to see what's happening there. Huge majority of peasants. And then you have people higher up on the echelon than them, which is government officials, military, nobility, priests, merchants, and then there's also this new phenomenon of urban workers, which is just beginning to grow. Then you have a 20th century cartoon critical of capitalism, and you see this hierarchy where money is at the top. Then it's the king and the nobles. Then it's the priests. Then it's the army. Then it's the bourgeois, the middle classes, and perhaps also the landowners. And then you have the workers. Then we have a quote from Marx. It's probably his most famous quote. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. It's just a painkiller, a drug for the people. It's just there to distract them from this world by promising them something better in the next world. It's not real. And then in source D, we have a lecture by Lenin when he talks about the 1905 revolution and how suddenly the workers were asking for their rights. They were wanting a constituent assembly, a parliament. They wanted the vote, and they were willing to die for it. So, question 1. Use the information given by the source to describe the level of industrialization achieved in Russia by 1900. So you obviously need to look at the fact, and you need to be specific, remember, that 84% are peasants, only 4% are workers. Those are the two facts you need to draw from the source, and then explain what it means. That the vast majority of people were peasants, who were working on farms, often with manual labor. And so it was not a very industrialized country. It was still an agrarian economy focused on agriculture. So that's fairly obvious, guys. Got to get better at this. How is source B? How is this cartoon in agreement with source A? Well, it shows you the majority of people are at the bottom. They're either peasants or workers. And then as the pyramid goes up, there's fewer and fewer people at the bottom. It's a hierarchy that is a pyramid. And so you need to speak about how there's workers at the bottom, and then you get military, priests, finally all the way to the Tsar. And we see that in the pie chart as well. And you need to quote actual figures and describe what you see in the picture. Source B, evaluate the reliability. Remember, important question that has a particular structure. Evaluate the reliability of this source for a modern historian studying the causes of the revolution. 6 marks. Oil B. Go through it like that. Oil B. Origin. It's a cartoon critical of capitalism, meaning it's a communist who's drawn a cartoon, and it's appeared in the beginning of the 20th century, before communism had come to power in Russia. That's the origin. Intention. It's there to criticize capitalism. It's there to show how unfair capitalism is. Limits. We are not given a full picture of the economic situation. They're simply slogans. It's simplistic. It shows us a pyramid, and it makes us assume that the workers are holding everything up, that everyone above them is an oppressor, is greedy, which is quite simplistic, and this is an example of bias. So, for example, it tells us that money is at the top of society. It tells us that the priests are there just to fool you, the people, that the army is just there to shoot you, and that the upper class eats for you, which is obviously a massive simplification and is an example of bias. So I would say the source is unreliable as a piece of history. It just shows us what communists believed. We can't build a picture of what was happening at that time from it. Then, how is Marx's view of religion consistent with that of the cartoonist and Source B? Refer directly to both sources. So it's 6 marks. So you need to give specific details out. So we see priests. They're near the top of the pyramid. And it says that they fool you. What does Marx say? He says religion is a sigh. It is opium. So both sources are saying it is not true. It's just there to fool you, to disguise the real world, and to distract you from trying to look after yourself in this world. Remember, Marx is a materialist. He doesn't believe in anything spiritual or anything even intellectual. Everything is just about money and economics and class conflict. And source D, do the workers hold the Tsar accountable for their problems? Justify your answer. Well, it's quite interesting. This is a difficult question. Because they say, if you look at what the workers said in their petition, they're actually blaming the masters. They ask the Tsar for help. They think that perhaps he does not know. They say, Sire, Father, don't refuse thy aid. Order and promise that our requests will be granted. They're not really blaming the Tsar. They're blaming the masters. They're blaming the situation. They're coming to the Tsar for help, not to blame him, or at least not explicitly. I'm sure there were revolutionaries there who did blame the Tsar, but this was a way of getting people who were still sympathetic to the Tsar and to the church on their side. What evidence is there in the text of the petition 3.6, read by Lenin during his speech, that the workers awaken to political consciousness? Quote from the text to support your answer. 6 marks. So what is political consciousness? This means to be conscious and aware of politics. So we see that the workers of St. Petersburg, they identify themselves as workers, and they're coming here. They've stopped work, they're taking action, and they're coming to the Tsar to ask for rights and for political requests. Civil liberties, fair wages, transfer of the land to the people, and the vote and parliament. These are all political requests. So you need to have quoted that. I would also mention the fact that they say we have 2 roads, freedom and happiness or the grave. So they're not only politically aware, they're committed to a cause. So you just need to go through the text carefully and draw out those parts and explain them carefully. So those are the causes of the 1905 revolution. And that is an example of how to answer those questions and how to understand those sources. We're going to leave it for today and for this week. I want you on Thursday to go through this video, to look at your notes carefully and make sure you understand everything we've done so far. Know what communism is. Know why the 1905 revolution happened. Next week, we're going to look at what were the results of the 1905 revolution. So today and tomorrow, go through pages 12 and 13 closely and make sure you understand everything we've done from pages 1 to 13. Thank you very much and have a good weekend. And if you have any questions about the source-based work that I marked and returned to you, please don't hesitate to mail me or message me. Again, the issue is not reading the questions closely, not overthinking it, not directly answering the question, but just going around in a circle and not focusing on the text. And then a lot of you battled with the concept of class struggle. Class struggle in communism is the eternal conflict between those who own the means of production, the assets, the land, and the workers. And Marx said that is the story of history, that there will always be conflict and there will always be warfare between the working class and the owners. And so the problem with that is, according to Pinker, is that there's no way to bring peace except by revolution. That there's no way of coming together, there's no way of having sympathy towards one another, according to Marx. It has to end in violence. So that's what class struggle is. Okay, so that's been 20 minutes. It should have taken you about 40 minutes to go through this because you should have paused at various times to make sure you understand where we are. And please make sure that up to page 13, you know exactly what is happening. And then on Monday, we're going to look at how Nicholas II responded to the 1905 revolution and how the revolutionaries responded to his response. All the best.